Chapter 4. Nancy and her father entered the 23rd floor office of Anne Nordqvist's agency. The walls were papered with posters of foreign places. "I love to travel," Miss Nordqvist explained, after Carson Drew had introduced her to Nancy and explained that Nancy wanted to speak to her for a few minutes. She ran a perfectly manicured hand through her pale blonde hair. "I just got back from a tour of mainland China, and the first thing that happens is that." Anne Nordqvist gestured to the day's newspaper Nancy had brought along. "It's awful, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," replied Nancy. "In fact, that's why I'm here. Miss Nordqvist, Roger Gould told me that you and Barton have been, well, quite frankly, having some problems working together. Something about royalty money." A tiny frown appeared on Anne Nordqvist's forehead. "I wouldn't exactly say we were having problems. You have to understand that royalty revenue is a complicated business. It goes through many channels and often takes some time before it ends up in the artist's pocket. I don't think Barton quite understood that. He felt he was getting shortchanged." "And he wasn't?" "I don't think so, not unless something irregular is going on at World." "They're my next stop," Nancy said. "Maybe you could tell me the names of the people there who handle Barton and Ben Fender." "Certainly. In fact, I'll make a list for you." The agent reached for a piece of paper, and Nancy studied the attractive woman as she wrote. She had a pleasant, straightforward manner, and she seemed open enough. But Nancy wondered whether there was more to her disagreement with Barton than she'd let on. "Here you are." Anne Nordqvist pushed the list toward Nancy, a half-dozen names written out in her neat, round handwriting. "I ought to warn you about Harold Marshall. He's not the easiest man to deal with." "Well, I'll try my best," Nancy said. She and Anne Nordqvist chatted with Carson Drew for a few minutes, Anne confirming some of the things the members of Ben Fender had said about Barton, that he tended to be publicity shy, and that he had indeed picked himself up and vanished on 2 occasions without telling a soul. "That makes finding him all the more difficult," Nancy told her, "because if he has been kidnapped, there are going to be plenty of people who won't believe it." "Like the little boy who cried wolf," Carson Drew supplied. "Exactly." Nancy stood up to go. "Well, I'll leave you two to do your business. Miss Nordqvist, thank you for your time." "You're welcome. I hope you can track Barton down quickly. We're awfully worried about him." Anne Nordqvist extended her hand to Nancy. "I hope next time we'll meet under more pleasant circumstances." "I do, too. By the way, would any of the people on this list fit these descriptions? A tall, heavy-set man with straight dark hair, but balding slightly. Or a shorter man with dark wavy hair, possibly wearing a gold ring in the shape of a dragon or sea monster?" Nancy looked up from her notes on the 2 men who had been seen backstage. Anne Nordqvist thought for a few seconds. "I don't believe so. No." She shook her head. "Okay, well, thanks again." Nancy said goodbye and walked the 10 blocks to World Communications offices. Normally, she would have been thrilled to be on the streets of New York, watching the stream of people and window shopping, but that day she walked quickly, her mind on Barton Novak as she weaved through the crowds. Had he been kidnapped, as Roger Gould suspected, or had he gone on his own, as the rest of the band seemed to think? Soon, World Communications loomed up in front of her, an imposing steel and glass tower with uniformed guards at the door. Not again, Nancy thought, recalling the guards at Radio City Music Hall. She prepared a little speech, but was surprised when the guards let her in with no trouble. In fact, though she found out no new information about Barton, the people at the company were happy to answer her questions. That is, until she got to the last person on the list Anne Nordqvist had given her, Harold Marshall. She opened the door with his name on it and found herself standing before a stylish, sharp-featured young woman of about her own age. The woman's dark hair gleamed with henna-red highlights, and her blue sweater was cut low in the front. "Yes," the woman looked up from her desk. "I'd like to see Mr. Marshall, please," Nancy smiled. The young woman did not smile back. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'd like to speak with him about Barton Novak." "Barton?" "I'm investigating his disappearance." "Mr. Marshall is a very busy man, Miss—" "Drew. Nancy Drew." Nancy extended her hand. The young woman barely touched it. "I'm afraid he's all booked up today." "Could it be that he has something to hide?" Nancy suggested, surprised at her own brazenness. When she got no response, she moved toward the inner door and pushed it open. "Hey, what are you doing? You can't go in there!" the secretary announced, following behind. "I've already done it," Nancy replied. She found herself facing a small, wiry man with a brown mustache and glasses, who was sitting behind an enormous desk. "Hello, Mr. Marshall." "Who are you?" He released a cloud of noxious cigar smoke as he spoke. "Vivian, what's she doing here? I gave specific instructions that—" "I'm sorry, Mr. Marshall," Vivian said, her voice taking on a honey-sweet tone. "But she barged right in here. I couldn't stop her. Please don't be angry." Harold Marshall's expression softened for a split second. "Oh, Vivian, of course it's not your fault. I didn't mean to snap at you." Nancy watched him. "But as for you, Miss Drew, did you say?" His expression changed to a sneer as he turned back to Nancy. "What is so important that you felt you could waltz right in here? First, my office is invaded by an idiot who thinks that just because he banged out a couple of Barton Novak's riffs last night, we must be dying to cut a record." "Alan?" Nancy groaned out loud. So poor Alan, filled with dreams of glory, had come face to face with Harold Marshall. Nancy's heart went out to him and to Bess. "You're a friend of his?" "Look, I told him no dice, and I mean it. Now, if you'll excuse me." Marshall swiveled around in his chair. "I am a friend of Alan's, but that's not why I'm here. I'm a detective, and I must ask you a few questions about Barton Novak. Anne Nordqvist said you handle his band." Marshall spun back around, puffing on his cigar. "Anne Nordqvist is a pushy dame." "You mean you don't handle Ben Fender?" Nancy asked. "I didn't say that." "Oh, all right. Go ahead and ask your questions, but be quick about it. I have more important things to do than chat away the morning with someone who calls herself a detective." Nancy felt her face flush with anger, but she tried to stay calm. "Mr. Marshall, suppose you tell me everything you can about Barton's disappearance." "Disappearance? Ha!" He snorted. "I hate to disappoint you, Miss Drew. I know how excited you must be about solving this mystery." His voice oozed sarcasm. "But Barton Novak is safe and sound." "He is?" Nancy's emotions were a confused jumble of astonishment, relief, and disbelief. "What do you mean?" "Publicity." Harold Marshall pronounced the word as if it were an explanation in itself. "I don't understand." "It's a publicity gimmick. News like this is certain to boost sales on Fender's most recent album. It's been done plenty of times before. Remember the rumor after the Beatles released Abbey Road that Paul McCartney had died? No, you were probably in diapers back then." "I do know what you're talking about," Nancy countered. She couldn't imagine a rock and roll fan who hadn't just about memorized the history of the Beatles. The record buyers kept thinking they saw clues about it on the album cover and in the lyrics to the songs. Isn't that right? "The girl detective gets an A+, Marshall said snidely. So you mean Barton's disappearance was engineered? Nancy shook the newspaper in anger, the realization of what Marshall had done washing over her like a tidal wave. Why didn't you tell anyone? The rest of the band members are either furious or scared stiff about him. Hey, Harold Marshall drawled. That anger and fear bought us 4-inch headlines. If we'd told them, their reactions wouldn't have been so real. He allowed himself a satisfied smile. That's a rotten, inhuman trick, Nancy exclaimed. Kid, this is business. What counts is what sells records. Marshall shrugged. Those fans are going to go wild when they think Barton's gone. They'll start looking for clues in the records, the rock videos. All teens think they're detectives, as you well understand, he added condescendingly. Nancy bristled. What I understand is that you think it's good business to lie to Bent Fender's fans. Either that or to lie to me. Look, Miss Drew, if you don't believe what I've told you about Barton, that's your problem. Anybody find a ransom note? No, admitted Nancy, fighting back the urge to grab the mug of coffee on his desk and fling it in his face. But couldn't you tell the rest of Bent Fender where Barton is, just for their own peace of mind? Let's get something straight. Harold Marshall's lips thinned. We're sitting on a publicity gold mine here. I only told you what's really happening so you'd stop wasting my time. If you go to the press with anything I said, I'll deny it. Who do you think they'll believe? Me or some kid playing detective? He stared at Nancy, challenging her. As for Barton, he's a big boy. He could call the band members to tell him he's okay, if he wanted. Maybe he wants some privacy. Think of this as a kind of vacation for him. And do us both a favor. Keep your mouth shut about this whole business. Nancy didn't like Harold Marshall's tone, but she had to admit to herself that what he was saying jived with everything she'd heard about Barton's thirst for privacy. Maybe, she said. But wasn't it strange to pull off this stunt right before the biggest of the Rock for Relief concerts? More publicity that way. Now, if we're all finished here, you can show yourself out. Nancy took a few steps toward the door, where Vivian, who had stood there all the time, put an insistent hand on Nancy's arm. The interview was clearly over. Oh, just one more thing, Mr. Marshall. Nancy turned in the doorway. She asked if he'd ever seen the 2 men described to her by the Radio City Guard. Marshall shrugged. How am I supposed to keep track of everyone who goes in and out of this place? Did I expect any other answer? Nancy asked herself, leaving Harold Marshall's office without further conversation. She found her way back to the elevator banks, rode down to the main floor, and walked past the indoor fountain and the greenery that adorned the lobby, into the crisp midday sunshine. Her head swam with conflicting thoughts as she made her way back to the hotel to meet George for lunch. Harold Marshall was one of the rudest, most self-important people she had ever met. But he was just the kind of person to cook up a sneaky publicity trick like the one he described. And the fact that no ransom note had been received would suggest that Barton hadn't been kidnapped. But what about the 2 mysterious men at the music hall and all the clues Nancy had discovered outside Barton's dressing room? Marshall's publicity scheme didn't explain them. And it didn't explain something else, Nancy thought. That attack on me last night was no stunt. It was serious, deadly serious. End of chapter 4.